Welcome to Community Homeworks class this evening on screen repair. Tonight our instructor is Julie, and she's going to take us from a screen that has no screen to a finished screen to help keep your bugs and things out of your house. Please remember that you can watch us live and submit your questions. We'd be glad to answer them as we go along. Or you can always go back and watch the video on our YouTube channel or our Facebook page. Please like us on YouTube so we'll be easier to find in the future. Hopefully you're going to learn how to fix your screens tonight. It's fun, it's easy, it's something you can do yourself. It's not hard. Everybody can try it. We'd like to welcome Julie. She's been here before. Some of you have met her, I'm sure. This is Julie Ryan. And she is going to teach us how to fix our screens. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Jane. I'm glad to be here.
We're so glad just to be back in this room. You have no idea. We're excited.
And this room is the Community Homeworks
Education Center.
Education Center, if you haven't been with us here before or seen one of our videos. All right, so let's go ahead and get started, everybody. We are going to go through a few things. Hopefully after this, you'll be able to understand the basic construction of screen doors and windows. You will understand how to assess damage and how to fix it, whether or not you can repair a particular screen or possibly need to replace it, and how to go about doing that. The primary thing we'll tell you about is how to make your screen go from, as Jean said, this one that doesn't have any screen in it, to something that is complete like this guy that has screen. It has little springs that'll hold it in. It has a little handle that makes it easy to pull out. And you'll also learn a little bit about patching minor tears if you need to do that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of the screen. Just to make it a little less confusing, we'll do it in pieces. This is part of the frame, and it comes in a variety of colors. It is made of aluminum. This is a piece of white. This is a piece of what they call mill. It's just aluminum colored. You can also typically get it in brown, and then there are some other colors as well. There's a basic structure to this, and that includes this spline channel right here. And the spline channel holds spline, and spline is what holds in the screen. So I'm just going to loosen up this piece of spline for you to see. That this pretty readily comes out. And with the right tools, will pretty readily go right back in. And that's how we hold screen in the frame. So the right tools, typically there is a screen roller that's very inexpensive that you can get at your local hardware store or a big box kind of hardware store. If you really need one and you can't afford it, Community Homeworks will also lend these out in some cases, although you probably want to check in with them on what their current lending practices are with COVID. There's also a style that has a metal wheel, and the metal wheel theoretically is more often used for a metal screen like this right here. It's a screen material that's made of metal. You may have seen it on your house. And the plastic wheel is typically used for fiberglass screen, which is right here. And basically one is cloth-like, made of fiberglass. One is metal and actually made of aluminum. And both come in a variety of colors. You can typically use either one for either application if you're sort of careful with it. So those are these are inexpensive. Usually you can get one of these guys for $3 or $4. These are usually maybe $5 to $6 depending on where you're looking for it. And if you're doing a lot of these, like a whole house worth or something, you might be interested in a professional level tool, but they are quite a bit more expensive. They certainly are available though. They all have a couple of common features. They have a wheel at one end that allows you to create a divot in the screen in order to put in the spline, and then they have a side that makes it easier to put in the spline. All right, so there's a couple of ways you can fix screens. Sometimes you can just do a simple patch. This screen has a pretty large tear in it, so a patch is probably not going to work out. But if you have a screen like this, which is in pretty good shape, but you know, there's a little tiny hole in this corner, so small that you can hardly see it, but you're definitely getting bugs in your house. There are screen patches like this one. This one's for metal screen. You can also buy them for fiberglass screen. We have fiberglass screen in this particular frame. And the way those work is they will either stick onto the surface and cover the hole and make it look like there's screen there, or you can get ones that you apply heat to make them adhere. Both of those work just fine. You can also use a little piece of Scotch tape if you don't have any of those on hand until you can get to actually replacing the screen. If you do have metal screen in your window screen, you would use this aluminum patch. And this is actually a little piece of aluminum. It's a little square. And you would put that over the patch or the whole area, and then you just bend these little metal tines in so that it grabs the original screen. So screen patching is also a problem. Sorry, screen patching is also a solution. As I said though, this one, the hole is too big. We're not going to be able to patch that. So we would need to replace that screen, and we can go ahead and go through the process of doing that from start to finish so that you know how to do it. I'm going to be right back. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for your patience. So what I got is a small screwdriver with a flat end, and I'm going to use this to take the old spline out of this screen. And you don't have to use this particular tool. You can use any kind of tool that you have on hand, but that is kind of a handy one. Another tool that's really handy to have on hand is a utility knife with a sharp blade that will make your job a lot easier. Another thing that's very handy to have, but not absolutely necessary, if you have one on hand though, is a putty knife. If you do not have a putty knife, you can certainly use a basic flathead screwdriver like this one. And we typically just use that to make sure that the spline is tucked into the corners. That is the most likely area where you might have spline come out. So with that in mind, before we actually patch this one, I want to show you one other issue you might have. So this screen is generally in good shape. The screen is currently not ripped, but you might find that you have an area where the spline has pulled out, and so the screen is not seated anymore. And sometimes you'll have this where the spline is still seated, but the screen is pulled out from it. So it leaves a gap, and you can see that gap, and bugs are getting in. And the simplest, this is sort of the simplest fix. It does require usually one of these spline tools that we talked about, or a lot of patience with something like a putty knife or one of these, because the spline channel is U-shaped, but it is narrower at the top than on the sides. So if you just try to push it in, say with your finger or something like that, you're unlikely to get it completely seated, and then it's just going to pop back out a couple days later. So if you do have a screen that has pulled out of the spline, it's the easiest thing to fix. Just make sure that the screen itself is intact. Use your spline tool and roll the screen back into the channel, into the spline channel. And then using whichever side you're comfortable with, but typically the directions will tell you to use the end that has a divot. Use that, and just with moderate pressure, you can press the spline right back in. And then, as I said, a putty knife can be handy to tuck that in at the corner. If you end up with a little bit of extra material because that spline stretched, no problem. You can trim that off with your trusty utility knife. So that is the simplest issue to fix. You have screen that's pulled away, or you have spline that's popped out and it's letting insects in, but the screen itself is intact and the spline is in good condition. This tool allows you to just reseat the screen and reseat the spline, and this is fixed and ready to go. All right, so now let's start working on this one here, which has this big rip in it. We can't possibly patch that guy. Again, we're going to start with whatever tool you have handy that's going to let you dig that spline out. Or if you don't have something like that to sort of dig the spline out of that channel, another way you can do it is just your utility knife. If you just cut the spline, we know that this screen isn't any good, so we don't care that we're cutting the screen as well. But if you just go several passes over that with the utility knife and then pop the screen out, it will usually pull out. It will usually pull out the spline as well. Okay? The other way that you can get it out is, like I said, with a simple screwdriver with a flat end, or if you had it an awl, which would look a lot like this but just have a little pointed end. And you can just stick it into a corner and lever up and get the spline out that way. Typically the spline is in there a lot tighter than you might appreciate, but it's not too hard to get at. Something that is important if you are fixing your screen is that frames may have different sizes of spline that fit in them. And if you need new spline, it's a great idea to take some of your old spline to the store with you. You don't need a lot of it. You know, just take a piece like that to the store and they'll be able to match up the size for your replacement spline. And there are a couple of very popular sizes, and those are stocked at the big box stores. There's also probably a wider selection of sizes available at the smaller hardware stores in town, like True Value and Ace.
Julie, if you only have to fix one window, can I buy just that much? Should I measure my window before I go and then like buy an extra foot to have
Yes,
some wiggle room? Or
that is a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. if you are going to the store, it is a great idea to measure how much you need, and then typically get about an extra foot. One thing about the local hardware stores like the True Value and the Ace, Midtown Ace and Gale's True Value that are here in Kalamazoo, or other similar stores in our general region, is they typically will sell spline in a bulk form. Thank you. A big bulk roll like this, and you can typically from that style buy it by the foot. Whereas if you go to Menards or Home Depot, you'll probably end up buying a package like this that's going to give you 20 feet of 3 different sizes of screen. So you may end up with 40 feet of, spline. So you may end up with, 60 feet of spline, and you only actually needed 10 feet, and now you've got all this extra, and you're going to put it in a drawer in your house, and you're going to lose it. And then the next year, you're going to buy another one of these, and pretty soon they're going to start to build up. That's what happens
because you probably also only need one size of the spline.
Correct. You probably only need one size.
So not only do you have to buy it again the next year, but you now have 2 packages of stuff you're never going to use.
Correct. Although a lot of people do have different style windows in their houses, especially if you have an older house. You may have some storm windows on some. You may have some replacement windows on some. So it's possible that you'll have more than one spline size that you'll need. But in any case, if you go with the smaller stores that actually do in-house screen and window repair, they will sell it in bulk so that you can buy just as much as you need and not really have all that waste. So let's talk about how to measure this so that you know how much you need.
Measure?
Yeah.
You see it up there?
Sure do.
I just put it away.
All right. I don't want to hurt your brains with too much math here, but the simple way to do this is to just kind of round up in inches. So we've got, doing it from the outside of the frame, 25 inches and 22 inches, okay? So if we add those together, that is going to be 47, okay? And if you double that and divide it by 12, that's going to give you the number of feet of spline that you need. And if you're concerned that you won't have enough, you can always add a little bit of extra. So I'm going to go ahead and do our math there. 47 times 2 equals 94. We'll divide that by 12 to get it into feet instead of inches, except that I can't tell multiplication from division, so. And so that is 7.8 feet. So I'd round that up to 8 or 9 feet, and then I would know I would have enough spline.
And it's not expensive.
No, typically spline is, if you're buying it from one of the bulk sellers, it is 15 to 25 cents a foot. If you are buying it in one of these packages, I honestly don't know what they go for off the top of my head, but you can easily find them on any of the big box store websites. But I don't know what the per foot price ends up being, but one of those packages is certainly going to go for more than just buying 8 feet of the size that you need.
And you don't have to remember where you put it away.
Exactly, because you'll just have just enough to use. If you're happy with that, I'm going to let you turn your brain off at this point. If you feel like I just did something redundant, I will also say that you can do the same thing and measure 25 inches by 22 inches. And that, the two sides added together, is known as united inches. And it is a way that screens and windows are measured. And if we did it with our united inch measurement, which is 47, instead of timesing by 2 and dividing by 12, which is 2 steps, we can just divide by 6 and we get the exact same number. So instead of adding up all 4 sides and dividing by 12, we just added up 2 sides and divided by 6.
And now that we're all thoroughly confused about how to do the math to get our spline, you can always take the frame with you to the store also.
That is true. That is true. So yes, I apologize if that was too much.
Don't let the math scare you from doing this project.
Yeah.
It's probably the hardest thing you'll have to do.
And it's really, basically, if that confused you, let's see, I've got 2 feet here, and I've got 2 feet here, so that's 4 feet. And now I've got almost 2 feet here. Almost 2 feet here. Well, now I've got 2 feet plus 2 feet plus 2 feet plus 2 feet. I've basically got 8 feet. I should get 8 feet of spline. If I'm concerned, I can get 9 feet. So
for 15 cents, it's nice to have the extra.
It is. It is. Sorry if I did my math too complicated. All right. So this is a bulk sheet of fiberglass screen. And there's a couple of ways that you can get fiberglass screen also. So you can, at the stores that do screen and window repair, like Gales True Value and the Midtown Ace, you can go in and buy just as much as you need. In this case, I would buy 3 feet. And they would sell you 3 feet for about $3. It's about $1 a foot. If you went to Menards or someplace like that, you would probably buy a 8-foot roll of 36-inch wide fiberglass screen, and that would probably cost you, $6.99 or something like that. You can also get those at the smaller stores often, but they often sell it by the foot, so you can get just exactly as much as you need.
And there again, no leftovers.
Yes.
Just scraps.
Because good luck keeping track of the extra 4 feet of screen or 5 feet of screen in this case that you would have after you did your 8-foot roll.
And no matter what you have left over, it won't fit the next window you have to fix anyway, right?
I'm not going to go with that. You might get lucky. You might get lucky. All right, so now we've got a piece of screen cut for the size of our window screen. And let's go ahead and start this process. I've got a couple of sizes of this bulk spline here. I'm going to check out, and this is essentially the process of going to the store with your spline, see what fits. And I'm going to just do that by putting it in. Does it go in with a little bit of tension, and does it take some work to get it out? And the answer in this case is yes. So I'm going to say this is the right size spline. And I happen to know that this spline is a little bit bigger. So that is going to be perfect size for it.
Does it fit, or do we just want to?
Oh, sure, we can show that one. So this is the next size up, and it will fit, but it's going to just require more work. So I've got to push a lot harder to get it in there, and that's fine. It's totally usable. If this is what you have in your house already, go ahead and use it. There's no problem with that. It's just
a lot more work.
This one's just going to be easier. It's more appropriate for this job than this one. I do want to mention one other thing, one other plug for going to the smaller stores that sell it in bulk. I don't know what Midtown Ace has on hand, but I know that Gales True Value has what we call foam spline, which is different than rubber spline, which is most likely what you're going to end up with if you buy one of those packages. You'll get a rubber spline, and there's nothing wrong with rubber spline. It's just a little bit less user friendly, in my opinion. The foam spline is a lot easier for the average person to work with. So if you see that you have an option, go with the foam spline over the rubber spline, in my opinion.
It is truly more forgiving, I guess maybe is the word, right?
It's more forgiving. It compresses really easy, so it's pretty easy to put in. I also find that it weathers better, and the rubber spline tends to dry out and break apart, and I have not found that issue with the foam spline. So that's just, a mostly full-time screen repair person's opinion. So you can take it or leave it. All right, let's go ahead and start this process. When I do this, I use my arm to hold the screen on the inside of the frame so that I'm always pulling screen from the outside. You typically want to have screen overhanging on all the edges by at least an inch, if not a couple of inches. If possible, if you want it to look nice, it's nice to have it lined up relatively parallel, that being the grain of the screen relative to the frame. If you have it kind of sideways like that, you will see that when you look at it. You'll see that the screen is crooked. So if it's pretty close to straight, typically you can't tell a difference. So I hold it inside, and then I run the screen tool in the screen channel, or in the spline channel.
And that's the end of the roller that is not notched, correct?
Correct. That's the end of the roller that's not notched. And holding the screen in there, it's going to always pull the screen from the outside, which means that we should have it pulling the screen evenly, and therefore this should make a nice straight screen line and not be all bubbled out. So to seat this corner, sometimes people like to use a tool like a screwdriver or a putty knife to seat that first corner to make sure it's nice and snug in there. And then again, using the notched side is the typical directions. You can bring your spline out across the area you're about to work in, and then just gently press that in and work your way down. If the screen that you're working with pops out of the spline channel, no worries. Just go back to where you were at, put your arm in there, hold the screen, get the screen back into the spline channel, and start again from wherever it dropped off. And there's one side done. Seems so easy, right?
And this is plastic. I mean, you can't hurt yourself with it.
That is correct.
It's not going to cut you or your children or.
Correct. I will say though that if you are overzealous with this tool and go over this fiberglass screen repeatedly, you can inadvertently split the screen. So once you've got that seated, we have a bird in here. Isn't that fun?
Just a basic thing.
Once you've got that seated, you don't need to go over it a whole bunch of times. You could inadvertently split the screen. So let's use that putty knife again to make sure that corner is fully seated, and that way you're less likely to have the corners pop out and then have to come back and do this again. So on the second side, I would also hold the screen. I'm using the non-notch side, and I'm getting the screen seated into the spline channel.
Could you go around and seat your screen all at once, or should you do side by side?
I prefer to do it side by side for a couple of reasons. Chances are good that it's not going to stay in. As you can see, it's already popped out, and I haven't even finished this one side. And typically the other reason is because I do the first two sides a little bit different than I do the second two sides. So if we go ahead and reseat the screen here. Sometimes you'll find that whatever your screen is doing, it doesn't want to stay in there at all, and that makes it much more challenging. In those cases, I'll just do a little bit at a time, and then I'll hold it with my finger so that it doesn't pop out, or it's less likely to pop out. Just do a little bit. This goes a lot easier if you do seat the screen in the spline channel first. So if you have to do it a little bit at a time, that's totally fine.
If you were to take your screen into Ace, True Value, the two places I know that will rescreen for you, what's an average cost for a window this size? She hasn't worked there for a few weeks.
So rounding up, in my estimation, this would cost you this is kind of a higher end estimate if I am doing the math right. Let's see if I'm going to do the math right here.
Cost of the spline, cost of the screen.
Yep, which, yeah, I can't do all that one by one, but thank you. But I do have a quick and dirty estimate. If I can get my calculator to work with me. So I'm just going to round up to 50 as our 2 dimensions. Because we were 22 by 24, I'm just rounding up to 50. And my quick and dirty estimation is that this would cost you between $12 and $13 to get redone at Gale's. I do not know what they charge at Midtown Ace, but it's probably not too different. Although I can also say that I don't know that my price structure is up to date, but I doubt for a screen this size it would be more than 15.
But you can, it's not going to cost you nearly that much to do it yourself.
No, to do it yourself, you've got, $3 into 3 feet of screen, and you've got
well, even at most $3 into spline, and that would be overestimating the spline.
Yeah, you've got much less than that. You've got less than $1.50 into spline. So you've got $4.50 total spent on your materials. And then if you buy this, that might be another $4. So you're under $10, and now you can fix this screen, but you also have the tool handy to fix other screens. So the next screen would only cost you, a little bit less than that. So you could probably fix it yourself for roughly half price. All right, so remember our first 2 sides held this screen in so it was pulling off from the outside. Now we want to make sure that the screen gets tight so it's not all floppy. So we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're not going to hold the screen in the middle. We're going to let it pull the screen from the inside. And this I am going to do in just short segments and then seat the screen. And I don't want to pull it extremely tight because aluminum it's not that strong of a metal. I mean, I could break this in half, no problem. The issue is if you pull the screen too tight, you can end up bowing the material, and it will literally bow so much that now you'll have a gap where insects can get in because the frame doesn't sit against the window, the screen frame doesn't sit against the window frame. So you want to do this relatively gently. Just let it pull naturally from the center, from the inside. Hold it in position there. And then again, we'll just feed that spline into the spline channel. And the reason why you don't want to pull it really, really tight when you're pressing the screen into the spline channel is as you feed the spline in, it is going to pull the screen in and make it even tighter. Okay? So then we're going to turn this and do the last side in the same way. Before I finish this side, I want to get my putty knife out and use that, or again, you can also use what you might have on hand, a flathead screwdriver. to make sure that that corner is nicely seated and unlikely to pop out. It's much easier to do though with a putty knife. Since I have one handy, I'm going to use it. All right.
And it could be a plastic putty knife too.
Oh, for sure.
Any putty knife.
Yep, any putty knife.
Or probably a spatula from your kitchen if you were really.
Honestly, yes, a spatula from your kitchen would work just fine. A small pry bar would work just fine. Just anything that's narrow enough to fit in there, which this obviously is, but it's so short, it's hard to exert much pressure over anything but that one little area. So something with a wider blade does work a little bit better.
And something that's not sharp, because you don't want to cut the spline when you're seating it in that corner.
Correct. All right, so let's do our last side. Same idea. We're just going to let the spline tool pull the screen from the inside. We'll just do a few inches at a time. And you may have noticed if you're paying attention, I'm actually not switching sides with this tool. You can do both of these functions with just the round end, and I often do. So I seat the screen in, and then I press this in. Traditionally, the instructions for the tool will tell you to use the round end to seat it, and use the notched, or seat the screen and use the notched end to seat the spline, and that is perfectly effective as well. I just find that if the one end works for both, why do I take the time to flip it over?
And you feel that way because you've done this for many, many, many screens?
Yes, I've done this for many, many screens, and so that's an easy way for me to do it. If it works better for you to use both ends, absolutely, use it in that fashion. However it works best for you. So very important, a sharp utility knife that's used very carefully. You can trim off your spline. We can use our putty knife or your spatula or whatever it is that you have on hand to tuck that end in. Again, tucking those corners and that end in is going to save you from having to redo this later. All right, the sharp knife, very important. You want to be very careful as you do this, but this is what's you're going to trim this extra material off, and that's going to make it look nice. And if this is sharp, it will easily cut through fiberglass screen, like that. If it's dull, it's going to be a lot harder. If you have to push harder, it's more likely to slip. It's more likely to slip into the screen and slash it and cut, what you've just done. Alternatively, it could slip and cut your hand or something like that. Be very careful using these. They are extremely sharp.
And it's easy to change the blade and make sure you have a sharp blade.
It is easy to change the blade. If you haven't seen the video on hand tools, you should go back and watch it. They probably go through how to change the blade on a utility knife. Also, if you have $8 or $9 to spare, technology has advanced substantially with utility knives. And instead of having to unscrew it and take it apart and get out a new blade and put it in, many of them work like this now, where if you push the blade all the way forward, there's a quick release button at the front, and you can just slide that out. And usually you have two sides to use, so you can flip it over, slide it back in, it locks back in place, pull that back, and boom, you're done. Which is, I have to tell you, just a heck of a lot easier than the old-fashioned ones where you have to unscrew the whole thing, take the whole body apart, and then the part that holds the blade falls out, and then,
Would have been a great Father's Day gift. Where were you last week?
Yes. Well, late Father's Days.
We have a question from Dorothy Jordan. She says, I live in a 100-year-old house. Some screens and storms are probably 1950s. Is rescreening any different than with my 1990s screen?
It shouldn't be extremely different. The materials may be So a couple of things. The material in the screen frame is likely metal in that case for an older one like that. But you don't necessarily have to put metal back into it unless you want to. A lot of times people just want all the screens on their house to match, so they just use the same material in every window. There's nothing wrong with metal screen. It is a long-lasting, very good product. I prefer fiberglass, especially for a do-it-yourselfer, because it's a lot easier to work with.
It's a lot more forgiving, and it doesn't, what would be the word, crease?
Yes, so when you use metal screen, as soon as you roll it into that spline channel, you've created a crease that will never ever come out. So then if you make a mistake and, you know, say your screen sort of twists as you're putting it in, and now it's sideways and you try to straighten it again, and now there's a crease in your working area. We can demonstrate this in a minute.
It's also sharp and pokey.
It is also sharp and pokey. So I do like fiberglass just for the ease of use. Something you'll often see in windows from the 50s, you may have what's called a storm window and screen setup on the outside. And sometimes those have parts, and those parts might break when you try to work on them. So the biggest thing to be aware of with older ones is to handle them gently, so that, you know, if any of the pieces are aged and fragile, that they don't break. But if they do break, you know, it's not the end of the world. Most pieces of even old window screens can be replaced. And typically you would want to go to, for this, honestly, I'm going to say Gale's True Value. Midtown Ace may have the parts. I know that they do repair screens, but I don't know that their inventory is as deep as it is at Gale's. But either place would likely have parts for you to replace that. So hopefully you see how easy it is for me to cut off this excess. I'm not pressing hard, and it cuts through this very easily. So did I answer your question about your 1950s windows versus your 1990s windows? The material is still likely to be, the frame material is still likely to be aluminum. The screen material might be aluminum, but it may have been replaced, you know, because you probably haven't lived there for 100 years. So maybe at some point they replaced everything with
Dorothy's lived in her house for over 100 years now. But look at Julie's hands. She just picked up her scraps and just wadded them up. The fiberglass screen does not hurt. You do not want to do that with the aluminum screen.
Correct. So, yeah, and I don't want to say that there's nothing dangerous about fiberglass. This can certainly generate a paper cut kind of thing. If you, you know, handle it in a similar manner, you'd have to try a lot harder, but it could give you kind of a paper cut style cut if you, like, say, you know, ran it quickly through, you know, the V of your finger. The other thing is, because it's fiberglass, it can give off those little glass particles that can make you itchy. It doesn't happen often. It's really a problem if you're taking out old fiberglass. I do recommend, if you're taking out old fiberglass that's really coming apart, it is going to let off a lot of that fiberglass particle stuff. And you don't want to breathe that stuff. And now that we all have masks on hand, if you've got an old screen, old fiberglass you're working on and you're pulling that out, you know, wear a paper or cloth mask so that you're not breathing that those fiberglass particles in. And gloves would be a great idea too. All right, I'm gonna find a garbage. Actually, Jean's gonna find a garbage. And then we're gonna do a screen with metal screen. So as I mentioned, if you have an older house, you may have either wood windows or even replacement windows that have been outfitted with storm storm windows on the exterior. And the way that storm windows typically work is there are 2 window frames and then a screen frame, and the windows slide up and down so that you can open and close it to use the screen. Some, all 3 panes will move, both windows and the screen. Some, just the windows will move and the screen is fixed. When you've got one like that, they usually move using these parts, which are called slide bolts. And you pull those in order to raise it up or lower it down. And then there are tilt keys. And the tilt keys have a counterpart on the bottom. They're all corners. The ones at the top are called tilt keys because they have these little pegs that help them hold in the track. And at the bottom, it's the slide bolt that holds it in the track, but it still needs a corner. This style window screen, if you're working on it, you might find that some of these pieces are broken and need to be replaced. And that's actually pretty easy to do for the average homeowner as well. If you feel like it's above you, certainly something they can fix at a place that does screen and window repair. All right, so let's do this one in this metal screen. And metal screen, you have to be a lot more careful with the product in general. You can't, you have to treat it delicately because, as I said, it's metal and it dents, and once it's dented, that dent never comes out. So like this end part is dented, possibly from storage or whatever, and that's, it makes it unusable unless you want, you know, a really bad looking screen. And that, when I say it's not just that it would be bad looking, when it's creased like that, you can't see out of it as well. And the whole point of windows is to be able to see out of them and get light in, right? So I usually use something I have handy to hold the screen in place when I start working on it. Try to get that kind of lined up there. And I'm just going to trim off, again, utility knife, nice and sharp. If you're going to work with aluminum, start with a new blade every time you start a new screen. And even that, I didn't quite get every little bit cut. So now this cut end is full of little pokey things that will stab you. So be very gentle, and if you have gloves, do wear them. A garden glove would work. A simple, you know, utility glove that you have around the house for, you know, whatever, cleaning up leaves, anything like that. Any kind of glove is going to be better than no gloves at all when you're working with metal. I'm just going to come around to the other side. You're going to lose me for a second because this is a very long piece of screen where you're going to get an extreme, not quite an extreme close-up. All right. So just to reinforce that this stuff is fragile.
We're still not totally cut.
Oh. So anytime I work with this stuff, whenever I put it away, I make sure that the roll is nice and snug, and I wrap it with large zip ties. If you buy this stuff in a larger package, it'll come with those. If you don't have if you have a small roll, because you only bought like an 8-foot roll, you can hopefully have some. I think everybody's got some of these in their kitchen drawer.
And you can hook the little ones together to make a long one.
Sure, but store it nicely because, again, it will dent and then it becomes unusable. Speaking of being unusable, let's explore the other end of this. This is another reason why aluminum is not exactly fun. It will always try to roll back up. So you can see here, I think that it's all dented. And it won't sit flat. And you know, I can crunch that up in my hand and it doesn't really come apart again. It was already dented and I just made it worse. Again, try to smooth it out, but it just doesn't happen. So
It's never going to be the same.
yep, so that portion of it is basically just not usable unless, you know, if you want the window to look nice and be visible or have good visibility. So I'm just gonna trim this off. You do have to cut pretty hard when you do this. If you don't have a surface that you can cut on, I suggest doing it outside and putting down a couple pieces of cardboard or a piece of scrap wood that you can cut against. If you don't have either of those available, I would suggest using scissors that you don't care about. You know,
They'll never be the same.
they'll never be the same after this. Exactly.
Go to the Dollar Tree and buy a pair,
Yep.
one for each window.
So if nothing else, hopefully we have so far demonstrated that, you know, metal is much more challenging to work with. You know, it has advantages too. It will last longer overall than fiberglass, but it can be a bear to work with, especially in smaller segments. All right, I flipped this over because I think it's going to be easier to keep it from getting all wacky on me. That's a technical term, getting all wacky. And it's reasonably square right now. With these kind of storm windows, you also want to try to make sure that the storm window itself is kind of square, because they can get kind of
They
cockeyed.
can get wacky too.
And if they do, you can have trouble getting it back in. So we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, but I'm going to do the process essentially the same. I want to hold the screen in place. Can I have that metal roller just to say I did it? So they will, if you do some research on this, often they'll say that you should use a metal roller for metal screen. You can absolutely use this. The metal is just a little bit harder on that material, and it may wear it out some. The problem with the metal roller is that it is not especially gentle on the metal screen. So this is unfortunately another disadvantage of metal screen. If you split it, you have to start over. And it's not very hard to split metal screen. So it's just kind of another thing you have to think about if you are trying to do metal screen yourself.
It's probably easier to rescreen all of your windows than to fix one or two metal screen ones.
It certainly can be a challenge. All right, so we rolled that in. One advantage of metal is when you roll that screen into the spline channel, it's going to stay there. So, you know, it's not like everything about metal is bad, but I want to pop this out real quick and show you. Hopefully you can see. It is kind of hard to tell, but there is a permanent crease now that, you know, it's not going to come out. I'm not 100% sure if you can see that or how well you can see it, but
This see it up against my sweater, maybe? Does that help to what background?
I don't know. Yeah, okay, so you can see that this line, yep, you can see that a little bit better. That crease is, again, never going to come out. And so if I ended up putting this in and it was crooked and I was unhappy with it, I'd have to try to start over by moving it down a little ways so that that crease wasn't part of it anymore. And as you can see for this screen, that would be pushing whether or not I have enough left over at that edge.
So maybe with metal screen, it's good to cut even more leeway around all the four edges just in case.
It probably is a good idea to give yourself a little bit more. and buy extra, because I can guarantee that your first try
May not be successful.
may not be
as the second.
successful. I can't guarantee that. Some people may be naturals at this, but it's certainly a possibility. All
I
right,
don't know which one you want.
this one should be fine.
Okay.
So with metal screen, actually, no. With metal screen, no matter what spline size you have, it's important to note that if you are changing from fiberglass screen to metal screen or vice versa, it may change the size of the spline that you need. So when you bring in your spline, make sure that you say, if you are changing materials, say, hey, I had fiberglass and I'm changing to metal, so maybe I could get one size down on the spline. Or if you had metal and you're changing to fiberglass, hey, maybe could I get one size up on the spline? So that's a good thing to think about. All right.
We have a question. Lynn Stevens wants to know, she said, I have an old wooden screen door.
Yep.
The screen sags badly. If I want to try rescreening it, should I reuse the spline or assume that it's rubber and it's brittle and should also be replaced, or how does she know?
So I always replace the spline because it's so inexpensive. Honestly, if it looks like it's in good shape, if it's not obviously cracked or anything, you can reuse it. Sometimes it won't be cracked, but it'll have turned rock hard. If it seems very difficult to use, it should be squeezable. If it's not squeezable, if it's cracking, any of those things, definitely replace it. If it's a problem for you to get, new stuff and it seems to be in okay condition, go ahead and reuse it. It's definitely something that can be situation specific. If it seems worn out and seems to have those warning signs, I do recommend replacing it because at 15 cents a foot, this stuff is very affordable. I do want to mention that what we're doing here, we're covering screens that have spline channels. Many older wood screens do not have spline channels, in which case typically the screen is attached with staples. And that is actually one of the times where it's often best to use a metal screen product, because when you're stapling and you staple fiberglass, and if there's wind action, it will start to tear the fiberglass against the staples, and it won't stay tight as long as a metal screen product. So if you are working with an old style wood screen or screen door, we'll come back to that in a second. Your tools typically are staples and often metal screen. Some wood screens and screen doors do have actually a spline channel that's almost routed into them or cut into them. And those I just typically would use spline the same as normal. So
don't some of them also have, like, you have to take molding off and then get your screen off and then staple it back down and then put the molding back?
Yeah, it's kind of its own whole class. If at some point you guys have demand for doing wooden screens, we can certainly do that because it is a more involved process. So I just want to let you guys know that nobody's perfect at this, and with metal screen, again, my spline tool, it rolled off, and now I've dented the screen, and I've dented it inside, just in this lower corner. If I was doing this to get paid for it, I would have to stop and move things around and try to get that spot off of the screen. For this demonstration, I'm going to let it go. If it's for your house and you're like, I'm going to just kind of push that back into shape and I'm not going to really worry about it because it's kind of low and in the corner, I'm just going to let it go. That's totally okay. I am going to switch tools.
It's only not okay if it's actually cut and then bugs could come in, because then you have defeated the point of rescreening.
Correct. So. Do you know what happened to the big screen tool? Did you put that back over here? Or did you put it over there? Thank you. All right, so just to make this go a little quicker, I'm going to use this because it is a burlier tool. Putting spline in metal screen is a little bit more challenging, and it's fine if it took me a half an hour to do this, you know, at home, and I was working with the $3 or $4 tool. But here, I don't want to have all this class time just be taken up by me trying to shove screen into that spline channel.
Does anyone else have questions?
So again, I'm holding the screen for these first two sides to try to get it to evenly pull from one side, in this case the outside. I'm going to tuck my screen in with this putty knife, and it's often easiest if you sort of do that on both corners. And then go ahead and feed your spline in. Make sure that your screen stays in the spline channel. Again, if it pops out and you end up sort of off track, you'll end up with a dent in your screen material. All right, so we're just going to turn. Usually at this point, I like to kind of make sure that it's flattened along the frame to get a tighter screen job with metal, which can be a little bit challenging.
And while Julie's doing that, not only can you buy fiberglass screen, but you can buy pet-proof fiberglass screen. So if you're doing a screen door that your dog or cats may put their paws up on, it is worth the extra money. It's much sturdier, heavier.
It is vinyl coated.
Yeah, bendable. I don't know what words I even want, but you can definitely tell the difference.
Yeah, it's very hard to tear.
It's also a little harder to see through, but not horrible.
Yeah, it seems worse than it is. Once you walk away from it, you realize that you can see through it pretty well. So again, for this third side, I'm putting the screen into the channel, and I'm not holding it in here, but I am going to hold it a little bit as I get the screen totally seated. This is where I don't want to have it pull the screen frame together too much, because it will bow and then it won't fit well in your window, and it may have a gap and let bugs in.
And it's amazing how easily you can
Bow the frame?
Yeah, or just even cattywomp it so that it's not square anymore.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so we're going to address that squareness issue. There's a couple of ways to do that. Typically what I would do is work on the corner of a table that I knew was square, or use an actual physical square to make sure that my frame didn't get too out of whack. In this case, I didn't have either of those things handy, so I'm going to show you the quick and dirty way.
What do you mean not handy?
Oh, see, we do have a square. All right, so we've got three sides in. Now, again, we don't want it too tight, and we're working on the last side. On the last side, I kind of go back to that method from the first side, and I hold the screen so that it's taking it more from the outside. Because again, I don't want to inadvertently bow the frame, because you can, especially with metal, make this too tight, and then, you know, your screen frame will be bowed in on all sides, and you will find that it doesn't meet up with the window frame and you have gaps. Just to make this easier, I'm going to cut off the extra spline so it's not in my way here.
And we know we've given you a lot of information this evening, so please remember you can always go back and watch the recorded version of this. You can't call us in with a question. But you can always text a question to education@communityhomeworks, and we will get back to you with an answer as soon as we can. But it's so much easier to do your first window while this video is playing. You can work along.
All right, so now, again, we're gonna trim off the excess. I want a brand new blade for that. I mean, if it's one that you use to just sort of cut the screen to size, that's fine. But don't just have whatever old blade you've got in there. It's much harder to cut through. You're gonna press up against the frame above the spline. You are gonna have to apply a little bit more pressure in this case. When you get to the end, you can usually just pull the screen and it'll cut itself off. It's kind of handy. And again, now you got all these little strands of metal. They can and will poke you. And you really need to be careful as you're doing this. You know, if this slips, you might end up in the ER because you've just, you know, sliced your gut open. I don't want to say anything, but I feel like I've been fortunate that I haven't cut myself. If you have, you know, Kevlar gloves around your house because you're a cook and you like to use a mandolin safely, this is a great time to bust out your Kevlar gloves. And then we'll trim out the corner there. Just make sure all our corners are seated. And voila.
And let's see how square we are.
Let's see how square we are. So we've got to kind of get it out of the way of our slide bolt here. So we are a little bit out of square. Hopefully
your house is too.
Yeah, right? Hopefully you guys can see that this is a little bit out of square. There's a gap here. You might be able to see it better if I put a piece of paper under here. Both sides. Whoa. Did the whole table just move?
Yes.
Oh.
You lean on it, you go bye-bye.
All right. So now you can see this gap here. See the white? There is definitely a gap. Sure. And I want to demonstrate this in the only plane I know how to do it. So it's going to be this way. Rock it back and forth a little bit. And you see that it's got some give. So the squareness, as long as it's not extremely out of square, is not going to be a killer for you. This still should go in just fine. And the window that you're putting it in, that window frame, storm window frame, will force it into the appropriate squareness. If you've got a little bit of slack in your screen. If it's extremely, extremely tight, then you may find that the window does this and that you can't get it to go in any direction. And when I say this, I mean that it'll kind of hold it at a cockeyed angle. But hopefully that won't be a problem. If it is, shake it back and forth a little bit like this, and it will usually like loosen the screen up just a little bit, and that will usually overcome whatever out of squareness you have so that you can get it into your window.
And remembering that old houses, quite often, nothing is square either. So don't work on getting it real square until you find out it doesn't fit.
Sure, yeah. Try to put it in before you spend too much time worrying about whether or not it's going to go back in. And yeah, so hopefully this works for you when you try it at home. I will tell you very honestly, you know, if this is your first time doing it, get enough material to assume that you're going to have to do it twice, whether it's fiberglass or metal, just in case. It never hurts to have a little bit of extra, and the material is not that expensive. Typically, when we've done the classes here, most people have been able to do it within their first or second attempt. So I don't think you need a ton of extra material. Most of the time, people are able to do this relatively easily on their own after, a little bit of instruction. So are there any questions while we have a little bit more time here about what we've done today or about any parts of these things?
It's actually fun. At least I think it's fun to do them.
It can be fun. It can also be frustrating if you're just starting out, but it certainly gets easier with practice. So it's definitely a great homeowner project. You could do your whole house in a weekend for, far less than it would cost you to have somebody else do it. And you may find that there are some that you feel are above your skill level, like our example with the woman that has the 100-year-old house. And this actually fits myself as well. I've got some old wood windows. I've got some, 70s replacement windows. And then I've got some windows that we put in ourselves just recently. And if I were not experienced with it, and I had this one huge wood window that had a giant wood screen, and it did have the trim, and you have to pry the trim off, I would pay somebody to do that for me because it's a lot of work. And it may require you cutting new pieces of trim, and if you don't have a saw to do that with, or be able to cut a perfect 45-degree angle, there's a lot of reasons why it might be easier to occasionally pay somebody else to do it for you. But for a typical either storm window screen or regular screen, this is a really easy, definitely I would say beginner level DIY project. And the materials are very inexpensive as well as the tools, and you don't need many.
And the tools are all reusable. So, because once you do your first window, you won't be afraid to tackle your second window. I did my daughter's house in Tennessee. I think I did 13 windows, and it saved us both lots and lots of money and helped sell her house. So thank you, Julie.
Yep.
Again, a wonderful, wonderful class. I hope you've all learned something. And again, you can always go back and watch those videos of any of our classes, or tonight's class, of course, on our Facebook page, Community Homeworks, or through our YouTube channel. And if no one has any other questions, thanks for watching. See you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Yay. I don't even know.